Hello and welcome to this event, A Screen New Deal. I can see the event attendees are racking up as we speak. So thank you so much for joining us here today. I think if in not lockdown, we would be sat in the HQ at BAFTA at 195 Piccadilly, but obviously the benefit of doing this online is that we can speak to you all around the world. So hello, wherever you are and however you're listening. I like to think some of you might be at your desks. Perhaps those in Europe might be on the sofa with a glass of wine. Some people are strolling down to the beach in Australia, maybe, or perhaps you're listening to this as a podcast, having a little 5K jog around the park. However you're listening and wherever you are very welcome here to join us here today. So my name is Aaron Matthews and I'm the Head of Industry Sustainability at BAFTA and I run the Albert project. We are an industry-backed project bringing the screen industries together to tackle our environmental impact and inspire sustainable living. Clearly, some of what I'm saying today is scripted and some is a bit more ad lib. So please bear with me as I try and stick to the script across the next 60 minutes. So welcome to this event, A Screen New Deal, convened to unpack the key findings and recommendations of the Screen New Deal report. There is so much in this report, but for me, the key message is the need for radical collaboration across the industry, across all of our peers here. So we're joined by Tim Snelson and Devni Acharya from Arup. Give us a wave, you two. There we are. They're going to lead us through the key findings of the Screen New Deal report, and they've had an epic task of compiling the research into just 60 pages. And now we're going to be trying to cram those 60 pages into the hour or hour and a half that we're spending here together. We're also joined by Dame Pippa Harris. Give us a wave, Pippa. There we are. BAFTA winning film and television producer, deputy chair of BAFTA. And Pippa's kindly agreed to help us today and in the future to lead a conversation around the Screen New Deal within the film industry moving forward. Last but not least, we're joined by Trisha Duffy. Hello, Trisha. There she is. Albert's strategy advisor and independent media consultant, who'll be picking up any of the questions that you all post in the Q&A and pitching them to the panelists on your behalf whenever she feels the moment is right. So please do ask away. She is the voice of the audience, or the voice of you all here today as we work through the findings. So this report was commissioned with the BFI and lottery funding. So I'm just going to hand over quickly to Harriet Finney, Director of External Affairs at the BFI, to say a quick hello.
I'm delighted to be able to say a few words today about this report and a bit of context around the BFI's involvement in a Screen New Deal. This report, which is hot off the press, published last week, is a result of a collaboration by the BFI with BAFTA Albert, who are leading on sustainability for the screen industries, and the design and engineering experts Arup. Our role at the BFI is to help film flourish, culturally and economically. And to do that, we focus on strategies and policy interventions that will enable film to grow and thrive in the UK. The industry's future prosperity is dependent on ensuring that we continue to be competitive and we continue to be innovative. And we believe a key to that is being sustainable. At the BFI, we use our National Lottery Research Fund to share insights and provide information, knowledge and data to help us support the industry and inform our policy work with government. As an organisation, we are involved at every stage of the film value chain, which means we have a fairly unique perspective, but also a huge responsibility. Looking at government policy, the UK is committed to net zero emissions by 2050. And that means every single sector will be required to make statutory changes to meet this target. We're taking this challenge seriously at the BFI, and we ourselves have committed to meet net zero emissions on all our activities by 2025. Next year, the eyes of the world will be on the UK as we host the rescheduled 26th Climate Change Summit, COP26. We will also be holding the presidency of the G7. But back to today. We're living in a time of change in so many different ways. We took this work forward in 2019, prior to the pandemic arriving and the shutdown in production across the globe. Now, as we see film and television production restarting, the industry is already looking at introducing new ways of working on set and on location, giving us the opportunity to look at how we're using materials and resources, and also to learn from how innovation is working for other industries. The BFI had already done some work in this area. Earlier in the year, just before the pandemic hit the UK, we published an evidence review, Green Matters, which drew together information and experience from industry practitioners. The report is available on our website. If you haven't seen it already, please do take a look. But what a Screen New Deal has set out to do is take us on to the next stage, which is analysing key areas where we can make change happen and move towards that net zero target. This is the first time we have tried to capture the carbon impact of film production. The analysis, recommendations, insights and case studies of best practice have been led by Arup with input from Albert and the industry. The report is designed to be a constructive way to help us all step up to the urgency of this challenge. At the BFI, we are very aware that we need to work together as an industry to find solutions and make change happen. We're all in this one together, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work very closely with BAFTA and others to ensure that as a sector we show leadership in our approach to sustainability and make clear progress to meeting that vital net zero target.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Harriet, and thank you so much to the BFI. Wow, a 2025 net zero target is certainly something to be proud of. And as Harriet points out, the UK has committed to reaching a goal of net zero by 2050. So I am 34 3/4. I will be 65 in 2050. So I'm planning to see this one through to retirement. And so whatever your age and whatever point of your career, I hope you're here for the journey. This is truly just the very start of the conversation in terms of a radical step forward for progress on the environment. 2050 is not that far away in the global picture of Earth's existence. So we're here to unpack all of that and what that means. So there's 230 of you now tuned in to Screen New Deal. That is, for us at Albert and BAFTA, groundbreaking. We've never had so many people convened to talk about the environmental issues within our industry. So some of you are probably here because you care deeply about the planet. Some of you might have spotted a business opportunity, and others you might be here just because you like to be in touch with cool industry conversations. So whoever you are, wherever you're here, you are very, very welcome. So of course, yes, I've arranged my house plants, so I've got a good background. I'm just going to own up to that one straight away. I'm not going to tell you that I've got a little bit of foundation to try and stave off the shine from my forehead. That is, of course, an industry secret. But back to the report, we make no apologies for the fact that this is a lengthy report. Some of you may have just looked at the title. Some of you may have, poured over every sentence. There's so much content, lots of recommendations requiring so many stakeholders, and this will be just the first in a series of events, meetings and activity to bring the industry together to try and move forward on this. We're not expecting to solve everything this afternoon, of course, but hopefully this will give you a sense of what the future could look like and how we might get there. As I mentioned earlier, please do join in the conversation in the Q&A if you've got a direct question for our panelists, in the chat if you just want to pass comment on something that has just been said, and equally using the hashtag #ScreenNewDeal on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn. The Albert team are ready to engage with you in conversation throughout this 90 minutes or an hour together, and also of course for the months and years to come. So first up, we're going to say hello to Devni. How are you doing, Devni?
Hey, good, thank you. Thanks for having us.
So I'd love it if you give us a bit of a detailed introduction on how it is that you came to this report.
I will do. Let me just quickly share my screen. Great, can everyone see the screen?
We can.
Fantastic. So before I go on to talk about what the project was all about and how we got to where we got to, just wanted to quickly introduce introduce myself. So my name is Devni Acharya, and I'm a senior consultant at Arup, which is a global engineering and professional services firm who've worked on a number of studios across the globe, with my colleague Tim, who you'll hear from later, leading a lot of that work. My background's in kind of systems thinking and systems change, with a focus on sustainable resource management. And over the last couple of years, my focus in life has been looking at how the construction industry can transition from a very carbon intensive, high waste system into a circular economy, which is all about decoupling economic and business growth from carbon emissions and resource consumption and those highly wasteful practices that we see. And so with the film industry being essentially a kind of a slightly different scale or form, but basically made up of lots of construction projects in itself, I was brought onto the project team. And the aim of the project was to develop a vision for sustainable film production. So how did we do this? So you can see on the screen there, a bit too quick. You can see on the screen there, we started off by being very fortunate enough for receiving sustainability data from 19 tentpole film productions across the UK and US, with these films having been completed in the last 5 years. And just for your benefit, tentpole films are films with budgets over $70 million US. And this was really to understand the scale of impact, but also the impact areas that we really need to focus our efforts on. We also looked into existing work done in this space, what we can actually build from and not start from scratch. We interviewed people from across the industry, from studio managers, suppliers, buildings engineers, directors, set designers, and location managers, as many people really as we could. And we were very lucky enough to visit some studios, some sets, and also one location set too. And from that, we distilled all these amazing insights into a long list of sustainability actions that we critiqued and prioritized during a workshop attended by many of the interviewees, but also many others as well. And that got us to a short list that we kind of tested with a few people in the industry to understand what works and how would it work in practice, but what wouldn't, and what do we really need to put in place to make it a reality. And thereborn was the sustainable film production vision. So before I quickly go on to the vision, I just wanted to share some of the insights that we got from the carbon data. So on average, we found that a tentpole film generates 2,840 tons of carbon emissions. To put that into context, that's the equivalent amount of about 170, the carbon generated from about 170 average UK homes in a year. And to kind of put that into more context, you would need about 3,700 acres of forest to sequester that carbon in a year. So that's the size of 4.5 Central Parks in New York, which is massive. And bearing in mind that's just one movie that or one film that we're talking about, you would need a hell of a lot of land to offset that carbon. So really, it's not about offsetting or sequestering carbon that we really need to focus on. It's about focusing our efforts on reducing carbon emissions in the first place. So the data that you can see here is presented in a way that it was reported for transparency. But if we kind of take a slightly different lens and try to understand where the emissions are coming from, about 51% it comes from transport, so that's land transport and air transport. We have about 34% coming from mains, electricity, and gas, so what people in the UK know as the grid. And we also have, from diesel generators alone, 15% of carbon emissions, which is quite crazy. But as I said, what we are showing you here is actually what's just being reported. And from our analysis, we found that not everything is being reported. It's very very much a discrete set of activities. From your own kind of experiences, you can probably see that things around materials procurement, the way in which materials kind of are manufactured, make their way to the site where they're used, and eventually their waste management and a few other things are not included. So this is definitely something that the industry needs to look towards, and I will kind of touch on that in a bit towards the end of this presentation. So the vision, it was very much inspired by a quote that you can see there from an environmental innovator called Michael Braungart. And I think the quote is really poignant because it really addresses the concerns of many people in the industry that we need to restrict creativity to deliver sustainable outcomes. But Braungart is suggesting you don't need to see them as opposing agendas, but see them as complementary. And actually, in some cases, sustainability might even require more creativity. He says, we see a world of abundance, not limits. And what if humans design products and systems that celebrate an abundance of human creativity, culture, and productivity, but in a way that leaves the ecological footprint to delight in, not lament in? So that was our inspiration. And here you can see the vision quite conceptually. It's split into 5 key areas: so production materials, energy use, studio buildings and facilities, studio sites and locations, and production planning. So what is the vision in each of these areas? So production materials, and this is covering the materials, the components and tools used for productions. The vision is about adopting the life cycle approach to delivering productions with these materials, and really keeping these materials in continuous use within the industry, seeing these materials go from production to production with potentially storage in between to create zero waste. And next up, we have energy and water. And by this, we mean the operational energy and water consumed by productions. And the vision for this is really about reducing the demand as much as possible, and therefore reducing the emissions as much as possible. And whatever is residual, meeting that with renewable energy sources. Next up, we have studio buildings and facilities. So by this, we mean the design of stages, offices, post-production facilities, and other ancillary buildings. And the vision for this is very much around retrofitting suitable existing buildings to create new stage space, or retrofitting existing studios so that they can meet the latest energy performance standards. And with all of these spaces, making sure that they're designed for adaptability and flexibility to make sure that wherever there is changing demand, it can be met and you can maximize space utilization. Next up, we have studio sites and locations. And by this, we mean this full integrated system of both permanent and temporary buildings and infrastructure. And there are 2 parts to this vision. The first is taking a user-centric approach to the design of studios to support people making sustainable choices when they're on site, but also making sure that it's the users that we focus on and their experience on site. How can we support their productivity, their work-life balance? And then the second part is really about optimizing transport routes so you can minimize the amount of vehicle demand that's used for moving people and goods around. And finally, production planning. This is the systems, the processes, and the information that sit behind the delivery of productions. And this is all about the use of digital technology and shared industry infrastructure to maximize the communication and materials exchange within between the various productions happening at the same time to support this zero waste industry that we're striving for. So what does this all mean in reality for everyone on this call and the rest of the industry who unfortunately couldn't make us today? Before I go into that, I just wanted to hand over to Siobhan, who's going to share a poll with you, I believe.
Oh, no, I think we're going to, thanks, Stephanie. I think we're actually going to check in with Pippa first. But thank you so much for setting up that optimistic vision. I have to say, when I first went to meet the Arup team, I tried to explain to them how unique and special the TV and film industry are. But they just kind of quite quickly seemed, if they Arup eat the construction industry for breakfast, they quite quickly got our number. I can tell you that much. What this report does is set out an optimistic vision, but clearly it is light years away from where we are now. So we've invited Pippa Harris to join us to be the voice of the production community and the voice of sanity, I think, as we move forward. So Pippa, I know you've read the report from cover to cover. How do you fancy our chances in delivering this?
Well, I mean, as you say, Aaron, it is extraordinarily ambitious what's outlined in this document, but also really exciting, because what's great about it is that throughout there are concrete examples being used. So for every solution, there are people who are already putting in practice similar solutions that are working. So it's not simply a set of ideas. These are things which are already working practically on the ground in different buildings, in different places around the world. So I think when you read it, you do feel quite heartened, because you think, well, actually, maybe we could make this work. And I think, we would all accept that we've got to make it work.
Fantastic. So a stubborn optimist in Dame Pippa Harris, I think so. But we'd love to know how you all feel on this agenda, whether you think a Screen New Deal is easy, optimistic, or perhaps not possible. So Siobhan is going to poll you now to see where you sit on our optimism continuum.
So while you're just answering the poll, everybody, I'm just going to just address a couple of questions, which I think Pippa's kind of answered one of them already, but it'd just be useful to frame this at the beginning, and I suspect that we'll come back to this issue again. So Ben has asked, the industry has long seen itself as an awareness creator, but this not only requests but demands that we look further. How do you see us as a coalition together, engaging the industry to look beyond just being awareness creators and committing to be tangible action drivers? That's probably a very broad question. It's really getting into this idea of collaboration, isn't it? And then there's a question about recycling, but I'll hold on to that one, because we're going to go through to each section. The person that's created that one as well. And someone's made a comment about low carbon holidays, but I'm not sure that's quite a question. So anyway, could you just give us maybe one or two lines about this kind of collaboration, uniting fronts?
I hope that's for Daphne, not for me, Tricia.
Whoever would feel they would like to. Yes, Stephanie, why don't you give it a go?
I can take that. It is, as I said, a step change to the way in which the industry is operating now, which is super scary whenever you're trying to do something different. So it is really about being confident, asking the right questions, getting people together who are also wanting to do something different, and then challenging the key decision makers that you're working with, and using this report as a way to say it can happen. And so why don't we try something different? Yes, it's a bit scary because maybe we haven't done it before, but we know that from case studies, it works and it makes sense and it's sustainable. So why not?
Brilliant. Thank you for that. I've
Thank
got
you,
others, but I'm going to hold them. Those who are asking questions, keep them coming. I'm going to hold them for relevant sections.
Thank you, Joshua. Thanks for your questions. And brilliant, we can see our poll results. So 0% saying walk in the park, 0% saying mission impossible, 10% of you thinking it feels a bit too much work, but it might be possible. 90% of you saying that this is a lot of work to do, but we think we can do it. And that is fantastic to have so many stubborn optimists with us here today. So we're now going to move through each of these chapters in turn. With each Arup, we're going to set out the key challenges and opportunities in each area. Then we'll ask Pippa, as I said, to be the voice of production and producing sanity as we move through, and Tricia will keep popping up to give us your questions too. So first, to production materials. Back to you, Devney. Based on your research, how can you summarise the issues in this area?
Sure. I hope you can see my screen now. And before I kind of go into this, I do want to say that some of the current challenges that we talk about, they are quite broad brushing, and I know that it's not applicable in all cases, but we have tried to kind of reflect the general industry norm. So I'm sure that there are some amazing things happening, and we may have not captured that, but this is to just show the kind of more the broad industry practices as we know it. So production materials, what currently happens now? So the focus, as I mentioned before, is being quite a challenge, is this thing about artistic freedom and not being confined by any kind of sustainability confines or requirements. And that is pretty much the biggest challenge to overcome. Some other challenges include just having lots of kind of materials or costumes available at hand, at your fingertips, just in case you may need them or may not need them, but you might need them, and if you do, you can't wait another day to buy it, which means you need to have it so you don't delay any of the program. The other challenges are around the separation of procurement budgets and strike budgets. And because these budgets are quite separate, there's no real incentive of thinking about the life cycle of the various materials that are coming through productions. People at the beginning plan for the beginning, people at the end plan for the end. And so, as I mentioned before, a life cycle approach to this is really needed. And finally, another challenge is that we spend a lot of time planning productions, but at the end, it's let's get out of here as quick as possible. And that kind of very short strike times perpetuates this culture of take, make, dispose, take, make, dispose. There doesn't seem to be enough time to kind of put this back into reuse networks. And so what are we proposing? So the three main areas is what you can see on screen there. And so the first is around reusing materials. So actually matching the supply with the demand of the set components, the costumes, the props, by using sharing platforms. And these sharing platforms will probably need to make use of warehouses for temporary storing materials that might not be using the props or costumes or at that given in moment in time, and really to use materials passports, which are provided by a third-party service provider of this kind of reuse network. And materials passports are essential because they provide information about the specification of these materials, it's how it's been used and in which film productions it's already been used in and its current location. And this really can give productions confidence that it's fit for purpose and can be used in the production that you're planning for. Next up, we have buying virgin materials responsibly. So where you can't use reusable materials from these reuse networks, how can we source virgin materials as sustainably as possible? And how can we use more responsible suppliers who are very transparent about the impact of their supply chains, rather than, I don't know, quickly going onto eBay, finding the thing that can be delivered tomorrow to meet your needs. And by sustainable materials as well, what do we mean by that? It's about, if it is for something that's going to re-enter the reuse network, it needs to be durable and therefore reusable. But on the other hand, if it's something that's going to be used quite quickly, is it readily recyclable? Is it biodegradable? And then finally, resource efficient set construction. This is all about digital design. So you may have heard of the term parametric design, and this is the use of a design technique that looks at the available materials in a database, for example, and kind of matching what's available to as close as the design that you need, so you're not requiring new materials. Another part is around digital fabrication to reduce material use, for example, through 3D printing. But the fundamental kind of thing around resource efficient set construction is the need to design for deconstruction. How do you design a set today, so that at the end of production, it can be dismantled rather than kind of torn down and with the materials damaged in the process. And you can do this through using mechanical connections of a glue, but that does require a new approach to designing. And so what are the critical requirements? It is essentially a new approach to designing. So art departments need to think about what happens to their materials at the end of a production, right from the start, and how kind of they can make use of these digital design and fabricate techniques in the process. There may be an opportunity to kind of create a new function or role that is solely there to actually dismantle sets carefully and slowly at the end, rather than kind of demolishing them to preserve their quality too. There's a need for third-party service providers that we're already seeing on the market, like Dress, to really take up this opportunity of providing reuse networks. And with that comes a need for space for warehouse storage in between in productions. And finally, as people working on productions, you can only buy sustainable materials if there are sustainable suppliers. So it's a call for people to take up that opportunity. Think about if you are a supplier, how can you be more sustainable in the materials that you use or the business models that you use? And that's it from me.
Cool, definitely. Just a quick question for you. You know, is this about progressing from where we are now, or to what is it should be considered a completely new way of working?
It's quite different to what we are now. I know there's some great things around the kind of end of the life cycle, so how production materials can go into charities or for schools, but there are lots of end of pipe thinking. We need to think from the beginning, and there's not really going to be a reuse network if there's no demand for those reusable materials from productions in the first place. So it is really about that front end thinking that we need to change.
Cool, thank you. We'll come on to planning, I think, later, which is the bit that sticks it all together. So, we've heard about recycling, responsible sourcing, while potentially more costly, don't seem beyond the imagination. But I guess what you're talking about here is asking all designers to think about the way that we design sets so they can be broken down, reused, before they've even thought about what they're designing. And it's worth pointing out here, we've got an event penciled in to focus on that specifically, because how many people in the industry are thinking about parametric design tools? I don't think many currently. So we've got an event with designers later on this year. Pippa, bringing you back in here as the voice of reason, how do you feel about asking your designers to build sets out of a potentially pre-approved list of materials? And what about any financial implications that might come along with that?
Yeah, well, I think to an extent people have been doing this. Certainly in my experience, working with someone like Eve Stewart when she was designing the sets of Call the Midwife for us, she was reusing the sets of Les Miserables. That might be news to the producers of Les Miserables, but she and a lot of designers do this regularly. But where it's difficult, I think, for individuals is clearly you're not in a position, she's not in a position, I'm not in a position to store sets. So I think it's crucial that we get buy-in from the studios, so that the studios here, both the actual physical studios like Leavesden and Pinewood and so on, are providing spaces where set materials can be stored, but also the people who have a throughput of productions, so the funding studios, are supporting this as well, because an individual producer or an individual designer is probably only going to work on a handful of productions across a 5-year period, and that's not going to make this change. It needs to be happening through lots of productions which are going on the whole time, and you can only really get that by getting a buy-in from the studios and getting their support.
Thank you. And I guess the key message as well, how we like to frame stuff at Albert, is that this is an opportunity, not an imposition. So there's no reason why shrewd, financially minded organisations wouldn't find a way to turn a profit on this. Trisha, I just wonder if we can check in with you, see if there's any questions right now.
So many questions. I mean, so many questions. So I apologise if we don't get to all of them, and some of the questions that came before the event as well. But one, Clive has asked specifically, so this is a sort of sub questions of what you've just been talking about. How much work has been done to actually look at the new material products that will replace the traditional materials which don't lend themselves to either, I guess, multiple use or recycling? I mean, I know we've seen some case studies of that because we've done sustainable Sept events ourselves as Albert in the past, and we've seen incredible case studies of things that are happening. But definitely, do you get the sense that there are new materials coming onto the market to deal with this demand?
I think the demand is definitely growing, and I think the suppliers are seeing the demand is growing, and therefore kind of making sure that their business is aligned to that demand. We are seeing new materials, and I think there's like definitely a growing use of, especially in the construction industry, timber where it is applicable, and I'm sure Tim can kind of talk about that. But what is really missing is the kind of the critical mass. I think you mentioned before that it's currently still slightly expensive because it's not the industry norm, and that demand isn't sufficient to kind of make it kind of financially favorable. Tim, I don't know whether you had anything to kind of add to that.
Yeah, and I guess it's coming back to the point you made about materials that are used on a short term, and there's a lot more research being done on the idea of what are called biological products, so things that are sort of grown rather than made in factories. So we get sort of plant-based plastics, that kind of thing. You know, if we can grow the materials that we're using for sets rather than making them in factories, then the end of life question becomes a lot more easy to address in terms of being able to recycle or send them back into the natural cycle, maybe. So that's an area of potential growth, I think, the use of more biological projects.
Well, somebody's asked a question actually specifically, which I think alludes to that, is, has there been consideration in your report when you've done this analysis to, so this is Candice, thank you Candice, in order to understand of effectively disposing of single-use items like that when they're made from plant-based projects, even if they appear to be more eco-friendly. So have we been able to weigh up in this report the environmental impact of perhaps disposing of your more environmentally friendly items like plant-based plastics, for example?
So we didn't do that specifically in this project, and I'd like to kind of add it was the waste management data that was quite limited in what we received. So in terms of kind of analysing options for better waste management, I think that was for us a gap that we really saw. And I think I think I'll come onto it in a little bit, but there is a need for kind of industry-wide waste signage that wherever you go, you kind of know which specific materials can be kind of put in which sort of storage and therefore sent over to appropriate. So as Tim was mentioning, if we're using biological materials like mycelium, making sure that even though it looks like cardboard potentially, people know to put it in the organic waste bin.
So more rules to enable greater freedom. I guess that's the the underlying thing. So Trisha, I'm going to have to leave your questions for now because one section down, 4 to go. Are we ready? I think we're going to have to pick up the pace a little bit here, guys. So Tim, bringing on you to talk about energy and waste. And this isn't your first year at Arup, is it? I think it's fair to say. I'd love to know a little bit more about your history and the department that you work with in Arup before we move on to talk about energy and water.
That was a schoolboy error. For not my first Zoom, I didn't unmute myself. So yeah, you're right. I have been at Arup for a while, and I'm a structural engineer by profession. And I've been working in the media sector for a good 15 years now, starting with Sky Studios out at Osterley, and working with other companies like Bloomberg, BBC, Ericsson, Red Bee, and Pinewood Studios over the years. So yeah, it's been a really interesting sector for me to work in because of the ability to get really into the kind of functional thinking of the studios and the clients, because they know how they want to use the buildings. So they tend to give pretty good briefs to us as designers for what they want. So yeah, it's been really, it was great when you contacted us, Aaron, and asked if we could help look at sustainability in the sector. And it was a real no-brainer to say, yes, we'd love to have a go.
Good start.
And put all that experience to good use.
Definitely. I mean, thank you. I mean, it's been really fun working together, I have to say. Coming back to the topic, you know, we know energy is a major contributor, 30% of the carbon footprint of tentpole productions, as we've heard at the start. Can you talk us through the current issues and why they exist?
Yep. Okay. So in terms of operational energy, I guess a lot of it is to do with diesel and the reliance on generators. But, you know, there are some kind of functional systemic comments to make as well. There's a big push domestically for us all to get smart meters installed from our energy companies so that we know how much energy we're using. Obviously, in a lot of commercial setups like studio buildings, they charge the productions at a flat rate for energy use. So there's not so much transparency around consumption and utility costs, whereas in America it tends to be a little bit more joined up. And as I mentioned, tends to be a big reliance on diesel generators. People are a bit paranoid about losing time on shoots if energy may not be that reliable. And also a lot of studios are dealing with how to upgrade aging infrastructure without losing production time. So sometimes these kind of upgrades and passive solutions can be perceived as being disruptive to the ongoing operations of the studios. So those are some of the current challenges. And in the report, we look at them in 3 sections: sort of energy demand reduction, sustainable energy sources, and also water reduction demand. You may not believe it, in the UK, famous for its drizzle, rain and grey skies, that actually water scarcity is in many parts of the UK a problem, and as it is in other parts of the world. So if we're talking about energy demand reduction, we're talking about efficient buildings, which actually could be fairly easy win, because there's a synergy and an overlap we find in design between thermal efficiency of the walls for reducing heating demand, and also the need for sound absorption and acoustics. It's essentially the same mineral wool product. So high insulation buildings will hopefully be good acoustic performing buildings as well. A big energy use in film production is the lighting. And the move towards LED lighting is going to make a huge difference in terms of reducing the energy demand. And if we can get the energy demand of productions down, and if the studios and the productions can communicate on the energy that's being used, and then we can start to reduce that demand, which starts to make sustainable energy sources able to make a bigger contribution. So that's the second sector we looked at. And the idea, obviously, that film studios tend to have big roofs, which could be the perfect place to park your photovoltaic array. Or in the case of Pinewood, we put gardens on the roofs, but that's more to do. That's a landscape and ecology story, which we'll come to in one of the later sections. So one of the big issues, of course, that leads to generator design is about reliability. And are you going to be filming when it's sunny enough to be running your studios off photovoltaic arrays? And this is a key kind of question. And we've been grappling with this on the new Elstree studios. And whether you're looking at a net zero idea where you're generating energy when you can and pumping it into the grid and then bringing energy back later. So it's a kind of system size consideration, or whether we're talking about on-site batteries and going down the kind of Tesla Studios type thinking. So in terms of critical design requirements, we're talking about passive design of buildings. A lot of that's driven by regulation. For modern buildings have to be energy efficient. But also we look very much with studio clients about how much of the time the studios are being used for shooting and how much is setup and strike time. And obviously during the setup, set build, rehearsal, you have the chance to have natural ventilation, maybe natural daylight, all kinds of stuff that maybe would be considered intrusive to the final shoot. Green infrastructure, I mentioned the Pinewood example with the green roofs and lots of greenery and ecology around the site. This can help with reducing urban heat island problems, which is the heat build-up locally around the buildings due to their energy use. And that would reduce the amount of potentially cooling or heating that is required in the buildings. So that then makes the renewable energy sources more, giving you better bang for your buck, I suppose. So water, if we talk about water, there are again big roofs, lots of hard standing for base camp and OB support vehicles and all that kind of stuff. So water recycling, catching that water and reusing it, that can make a huge difference to the overall water impact of the studio facility. And we're putting it pretty bluntly here about banning diesel generators. So there's other kinds of generators that are coming onto the market, or biodiesel, or less impactful than diesel generators. But diesel was a big number that came up in our data that can be addressed and needs to be addressed. And reducing reliance on diesel generators comes from having reliable permanent grid connections across the studios and popular filming locations. If you can guarantee enough energy that you don't need generators, then people won't need to use them.
Cool. Thank you so much. I mean, this conversation is obviously clearly convened around the intersection between production and the facilities, studio facilities themselves. This section is clearly very beyond the control of a producer and production and the changes that we can make, despite the fact it's using up, contributing 30% of our footprint. Pippa, to bring you back in here, we said before that some things are in the gift of the producer. This clearly isn't. But if you're going to get a studio to change its energy contract for the purposes of your film, what is the role of a producer in this kind of complex arena?
Well, I think it's to keep pushing the studios to do the right thing. I think we all think that they need to be much greener. We all want there to be electric vehicle points. There aren't any, as far as I'm aware, or there are very, very few. We all want them to be buying their electricity from sustainable sources. And I think we have to, as producers, ask them about, do they know about this report? Do they know about the Green New Deal? And keep asking the questions and keep pushing, because they need to be drawing us to them by their good practice, and it will become a business decision for them. And actually, it will probably save them money in the long run. And it'll certainly save production's money. It's totally nonsensical that each production gears up separately with its own set of washing machines, its own set of generators, etc., and then just gears back down again. That should be something that's there as permanent infrastructure.
So we're not expecting producers to hold all the 60 pages in their head all the time. Is it okay just for producers to our studios, are they supporting a Green New Deal in essence? Is that realistic?
Yeah. I don't see why not.
I hope so. I think it's important to make it, this is radical collaboration. This is an opportunity for studios, but also it's a whole industry problem. It's not one that just studios can fix it without everyone's input. So, Tim, back to you for studio buildings and facilities. And I think we're going to have to pick up the pace if I can get you to.
Yep, we'll rattle on
through the next exciting bit of facilities and buildings.
And obviously everyone will be itching to read the report afterwards.
Of course.
So design of stages, offices, post-production facilities and other such buildings. So the current challenge, obviously there's aging infrastructure, as I say, some buildings more usable than others for current changing demands of the industry. Some people we saw perceived limitations to retrofits, but on the other hand, we at Arup have had more clients coming and asking us to put studios into all kinds of crazy places, from carpet warehouses to supermarkets. So this question about using buildings that already exist, so we don't have to invest carbon in building new ones, is an interesting opportunity, I think.
Tim, would you mind sharing your screen, please?
Oh, yeah, good point. Thank you. Okay, is that better?
It is.
So, yeah, excellent. So we're on to the current challenges of studio buildings. So utilization of spaces. Obviously, we want to make sure that the studios are being fully used in all their spaces. And this is something we've tried to address in our recent designs, where the size and proportion of the buildings enables them to be either a recording space or a workshop space, or a sort of general utility space. So we avoid the issue that you design something really bespoke as, say, a canteen, and then 10 years down the line, it's totally useless for use in the film in a different use. So we talked about retrofits. Another issue is about management of energy that we talked about. So the idea of a building management system that tells you what's going on in the building. So many buildings don't have that. It's relatively new. I guess some of you may be familiar with the idea of a Nest system, say, that gives you feedback on what you're doing in the building, that kind of intelligent system. So, and the idea to make our facilities in a way that they won't become useless in 10 to 20 years down the line. So repurposing buildings, building products as a service, and smart building management were the three topics that we covered in buildings. In the repurposing buildings, we're talking about flexible spaces and really making total use of the studio site that you've got available. In this little cartoon on the screen, we're showing a backdrop that's suspended off the wall of the studio. And that's just a little trick that we put into some of the master plans that we've been working on with studios, so that actually the buildings can become the backlots. Maybe you can configure the streets such that they're appropriate for European boulevards or something like that. Whatever you can do to maximize the usability of the carbon you're investing in making a studio. So when we come to looking at building products as a service, maybe modular construction, so elements that can come with a frame that can be taken away and reused rather than thrown away. We're talking about more intelligent buildings, so buildings that can give you feedback on their performance. This is what we mean by building management systems and smart building management. So they tell you when they're going to need maintenance, because they tell you that the efficiency, for example, on the air conditioning system is dropping, and therefore you know something needs to go and have a look at it. Another new innovation in the sector is the idea of products as a service. So instead of buying lights for all your studios, you could enter into a service contract, much as you do with your mobile phone and your TV provider, for example, for lighting. So you could go into a contract with somebody like Philips and say, we want to have so many kilowatts per square meter of lighting in the studio, and you pay per month for that. And then the incentive is on the lighting provider to make it as efficient as possible, because obviously that way they get a bigger margin between what they're spending on the supply of that energy compared to what they're charging the client. And then when we talk about smart building management, building information modeling, this is where we effectively build a virtual version of the building and how it operates in our computers before we build it in reality. So we can simulate how the buildings are going to operate, but then that can go on into facilities management and giving people dashboards and data, provided that we've got the sensors put into the building that will then give the feedback loop so that the building system knows what's going on in the building. Other uses for sensors obviously are simple stuff like turning lights and heating off when there's nobody in the room, and that kind of critical requirements, service-based procurements and operations and maintenance approaches, keeping things as efficient as possible, using BIM to optimize the initial design and build and operation of facilities, so we can effectively pre-design we can test the operation of the buildings before we build them, and real-time data on utility consumption. Those are the things I think I've talked about.
Fantastic. Tricia, have we got just one quick question before we move on to the next section? I know we've got to keep up the pace.
But I'm saying don't field any questions. I've been desperately trying to answer them myself. Yeah, I mean, we've got so many questions. It's hard to know where to start. There is a lot of questions coming through actually, which I'll summarise. There's quite a few on this about, are we sure that the solutions that we put in place are not worse than the problem? So as we start to create new technologies and develop new technological systems that are dealing with one issue, are we going to be inadvertently creating emissions elsewhere in the supply chain? And I've tried to respond to one of those questions saying that measurement is key, and I know that that is a big theme throughout the report, but I don't know whether you could just touch on that very briefly, Tim.
Oh, big question. Yes. Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. That's why measurement is important. We've had 10 years of energy regulation in the UK now, and the government are claiming on that basis a sort of 40% reduction in energy use in new buildings. And now we're only just realizing that the embodied carbon that we use to make buildings is becoming an equally big problem, but we never measured it. So all of these things, I think the feedback loop is really important, because if you do try something and discover that it's not better than what you were doing before, then you obviously need that feedback to be able to change direction rapidly.
Consolidated measurement and reporting, I think, is going to be absolutely critical here. Let's push on and think about the studio sites and locations themselves. We can stay with you, Tim, for the next section.
Yeah. So I will remember to share my screen this time. So this is tricky in some respects in terms of this dealing about the system of buildings and infrastructures and shared spaces in terms of location. And obviously we get this whole logistical thing about people getting to and from the studios, goods and services getting to and from the studios. And often this is a bit ad hoc and not coordinated, certainly not coordinated between productions. And this is partly due to the fact, again, it's not really measured. Now, in fairness to a lot of the major studios, they provide things like shuttle bus services and all the sort of basics that you would expect. But the idea of consolidated logistics is going to be quite important.
So I guess that comes back to the radical collaboration. Studios had never really before understood the impacts of productions themselves. So with a greater awareness and sharing of that information, presumably.
Yeah, we obviously need to get away from the position where the studios say they're doing what they can and it's up to the productions, and the productions saying they're doing the best they can, but they need the help of the studios. So yeah, we need everyone to join together in the push. So another issue in this sector we found was around wayfinding and communication on stages. And obviously that's partly to do with physical wayfinding, but also the idea of a digital concierge. I think we're all a lot more au fait with the idea of apps that help us find our way around, you know, from simple things like Google Maps. And surely our locations and studios can provide a pretty similar sort of thing. We also put into this chapter the idea of health and well-being services, which is important because there's a lot of people working in a studio, and sustainability isn't just about the planet. If we're being holistic about sustainability, it's about people thriving as well. And you know, obviously the classic caricature would be that you cram your studio full of money-making facilities and stages, and they become a horrible place to work. And a lot of studios have grown beyond that now, and recognise the need for health and well-being, like good catering facilities that provide healthy meals, a bit of work-life balance. There was a mention earlier about charging points for electrical vehicles and things like that. You know, these sorts of things need to come in.
I know there's going to be some critical requirements, but perhaps we can deal with them in some of the Q&As. I'm keen to bring Pippa in at this point to say, you know, this is a bold new vision that we're setting for the industry, and that's quite different from the one we're at today, where studios know where productions are and what they're doing. You know, how comfortable are you with this style of intervention? It's all a bit Black Mirror, where a studio knows what you're up to. And could you even conceive making a film in that environment?
Well, I think the studios know what you're up to by and large anyway. So I think this is more about communication. And as Tim was saying, you know, the idea that on a very simple level, that waste recycling is clearly labelled, so that it's not down to the production to go around putting bins for their recycling and sorting it all themselves, that it's all set up for them, you know, for a production coming in. Clearly that's a benefit. And also, you know, I was just thinking, as he was saying, talking about that work-life balance and how important it is. You know, for me, I think the initiatives that people like Wonderworks are doing up at Leavesden with Warner Brothers, where there's going to be a nursery on site, you know, those are real step changes in the way we all live our lives, and the ability of working families to deal with childcare, and the fact that studios can help them deal with childcare, I think is a really inspirational case study that's in the report.
I think, yeah, the lockdown has certainly reminded us all that we're human, I think, and have human needs. And, you know, I was really surprised to see that in the report. And I think it's fantastic to see there. Tricia, just to bring you back in very quickly to give your own perspective, actually, you know, as a consultant who works across the media landscape with creative organisations, we don't have the services that we need for this version of the future. Can you talk through kind of where you see the opportunities and for companies that might not even exist yet?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, what this has really articulated for me personally, given my other work, is exactly that there's a really great opportunity here for people to create new job opportunities, new innovation, new services that are going to be required in order to fulfill the obligations of the industry in the future. And if you think about how TV particularly, and also film as well, in the last sort of 20 years has evolved, where, you know, 20 years ago we suddenly got the memo that said we're supposed to be responsible for our own health and safety, and so we sort of created new organizations. I mean, First Option's a really, really good, exciting example of how a brand new operation came out of the fact that we all sort of woke up to the fact that we were already responsible for that in terms of legislation. I mean, 15 years ago, we didn't have job titles like media manager, and now we have those jobs because we know that all of our files need to be collated, and the data and the metadata needs to be tracked and understood. Whereas before, we were just dealing with a roll of film or a tape. We knew exactly where it was and we wrote it on the label. So the industry does evolve and it changes all the time. So actually, this is where the opportunity and the optimism comes from, because what we're potentially going to be responsible for here is creating new opportunities, new jobs, new innovation, new services, new products for our industry, which will be better for everybody, but it will need to evolve.
It's definitely a journey. I think we're learning that quite quickly. Definitely to bring you back in for the last section, which is production planning, and I think is, you know, critically the glue that stitches all that together. So, you know, what does the current landscape look like, and what's the direction of travel? Oh, you're on mute, Stephanie.
Unmute. I was going to go and save some time, but I won't save some time. I'll quickly go and talk about the current challenge. So in terms of working practices, it seems that currently people in the industry on the whole feel like they need to be together in the same place to make decisions. And actually what we've learned over the last couple of months is that that's not necessarily true to be effective and successful. In terms of day-to-day communications, they can be fragmented, from sharing information from a Dropbox or email, and all of a sudden someone changes a decision, and then that's all kind of that's all redundant, and then something else needs to be shared, and it could be shared from somewhere else. Everyone kind of having different parallel conversations, and there seems to be a kind of a need for a single source of truth that I'll go on to later, the digital kind of solutions can provide. And then finally, there's also, at the moment, limited data collection. I think it's seen as quite a chore, because it's quite a manual process, even through kind of filling the Albert Carbon calculator. Someone needs to be there kind of chasing lots of people to gather all this data. But is there a way that we can actually automate the process of collecting this data through the building management systems that Tim was mentioning, or through the kind of more shared procurement services where we kind of understand by line item, what are we buying and from where? So the opportunities that we see, there's definitely one around collaboration tools. And so how can we use these kind of collaborative sharing platforms to communicate and plan productions from the outset together? And this coordination is essential because that allows kind of redundant procurement not to take place. It allows you to only kind of build what you need to, because you've already gone through that process of thinking with other people and documenting it, that it's only one of these things that is needed. Moving on to virtual planning. This is a very exciting area, and I know it's kind of picking up in the industry at the moment, but how can you use virtual reality, or how can more specifically, how can directors and producers use virtual reality to really test concepts of storyboards, sets and scenes, to understand what needs to be made or what angles of shooting are required, so you're buying the right things, and also you kind of plan better, and you know what shot you're doing straight after the other, and you can kind of reduce program in that respect. And then finally, I think this is a very, very interesting area that I would love to hear other people's thoughts on. And it's kind of building on the question that Trisha was answering about the business opportunity. There is a massive business opportunity to serve the industry through these kind of shared pieces of infrastructure. And I know there are lots of online location libraries already in the market, but how can we kind of embed sustainability within them? How can we understand that certain locations are more sustainable than others? How can we kind of map grid connections close to very popular filming locations to know where there are opportunities to be more sustainable? I mentioned kind of this shared procurement services. So instead of different departments kind of buying through their own channels, how can we kind of streamline this? And so that you can pick from a kind of shared procurement system more sustainable suppliers, And a kind of another benefit of that is that if you're having multiple people using a single system, you can also consolidate the transport of goods and services to sites. And then finally, the whole thing around considering an industry sustainability fund, and how that could be beneficial. There are lots of questions, of course, around how that would be created, who it would be managed by, who pays into it. But really, this is something which will be essential at creating that kind of culture of shared responsibility. But also the fact that it is shared means that there will hopefully a critical mass of productions that will use it as well. And I will stop there.
Yeah, and I guess it's not just about, new funds of new money. It could be as simple as putting money that was spent on unsustainable places and kind of rediverting into the kind of creating the culture, creating the system that we all need in the future. Pippa, I mean, we've asked you here as the voice of reason for the production community and producing community, but you've also been someone working as chair of BAFTA and in a number of roles convening the industry. In your experience along this journey of the next however long it takes, decade or two perhaps, who should be doing what?
Well, clearly everyone has a part to play. It's not simply down to the studios to do everything. But I do think a good first step will be to get the studios to sort out the physical infrastructure, because once that's in place, then the organizational infrastructure, as it were, which overlays it, will be easier to sort out. But I think all of us have a part to play. We're setting up a new film forum, which I'm going to chair, which will hopefully help to push forward all of these ideas. On many different fronts. But as I said earlier, I think for individual crew members, it's important to always be pushing, your line manager, your producer, your production company to say, what are you doing? Why isn't your production Albert certified? The Albert certification has obviously been going for a long time in TV, but it's only really just starting in film. We got 1917 certified last year, and it was the first big film to do that, but there's no reason why everybody else's films can't be doing that.
Thank you, Trisha. Just thanks, Pippa. Trisha, we're so far away from this at the moment. How do we make sure that this big report doesn't disappear into desk drawers?
Yeah, I mean, that's the danger with all these things, isn't it? 60 pages, and it's quite a tome, and there's a lot in there. And so actually we sort of pick that up and put it in our desk drawer and think we'll get back to it later. That really will be missing an opportunity. So Albert and Arup and the BFI has been said very, very widely. It's been distributed widely. Really now we need all of you. I mean, there are hundreds of you on this webinar with us to share it with the people that you can influence, with the people that have the ability to see this change. And also we need to be really proud of it and understand that this is a great opportunity and not be afraid to kind of go back to it over time. The statute and the legislation is there. 2050 is legislation. So a few people have been asking about government, what government can do to support us. Well, government will put the spotlight on every industry, and the television and the film industry will not be exempt from that. We might not be the first place to look, but we will eventually be under the spotlight and be required to work to that statute. And so we've got to think about budget, carbon budget, not just financial budget. We've got to think about adaptation, and all of those things are relevant to us no matter what part of the sector we're working in. So to be economically stable, to be sustainable, and to be financially sustainable, you need to think about all of these things and just keep on going back to it. I also want to just raise one question on that, which is directed to you, Pippa, specifically, really asking, is it a competitive advantage to be a sustainable production destination as a studio, and then presumably extrapolation from that as a sustainable producer as you are?
Yeah, absolutely. I think more and more producers are looking at studio spaces through that prism, and there are new studios being built. Steve Knight is obviously spearheading one of them up in Birmingham, which are setting out their stall very clearly to be the greenest studio in the UK. So I feel like there is a sea change going on, with everyone realizing that that's what producers and productions want. So they're trying to hopefully get everything sorted as quickly as they can.
Yeah.
I look forward to the day where we can say, come and shoot in the UK, carbon, zero carbon, zero waste. Wouldn't that be amazing selling point? So before we kind of open up for questions, Devni, if I could be so bold as to ask you to summarize 6 months of work across 60 pages into 6 bullet points in 6 seconds, or perhaps maybe 30 seconds. In conclusion, what are the key take homes here? Oh, you're on mute, Devni.
Again, I wish I could speak really fast and do this in 6 seconds.
It's more complicated. We've got to give this space. This is the end of the world, guys. This is we can give it more than 6 seconds.
So if you haven't quite managed to take in anything that we've said today, please listen to these last 6 bullet points. I think they're not going to be a surprise to you, because there are things that we've all kind of been mentioning over the last hour and 17 minutes. But the first one is really about understanding the true impact of every single film that is produced. There is a need for the industry across the globe to come together and think about the way or the framework in which film, the impact and the carbon emissions from film is reported. It's not a specific tool that you need to use, it's a framework that covers a specific scope, so that we can start to compare productions from productions, and actually learn where best practice is, and drive the agenda through real data. The second is around digital collaboration. I think I've just kind of gone over that, but it is around using more cloud-based collaboration platforms to enable crew to collaborate and communicate more effectively, so that they can plan and deliver some amazing sustainable productions. The third one is around end-of-life planning, and it comes back to one of the first things I mentioned is, how can we start thinking about the end right at the beginning? It's not about making decisions now for the impact now, but it is about looking at the whole kind of life cycle of productions, and making sure that you're minimizing impact through every single point during that production. And then finally, studios supporting productions. I think we kind of covered this as well. Studios are the home for many productions, and so if studios are not able to provide the infrastructure to allow studios to be productions to be sustainable, productions cannot be sustainable. So a real kind of encouragement for studios to see themselves as leaders, and that kind of brings us to the next is leadership. How can the bigger studios, the bigger production houses, the bigger organizations start to really drive this and create the market that kind of smaller productions can kind of build on and make use of? And then finally, again, this sense of shared responsibility. How can we kind of align incentives between different organizations, from studios to productions? And also, how does everyone have a role to play? And the only way that can happen is if we all actually do come together in a room, talk about it, and make it happen. It's not about just the report.
Back to that radical collaboration theme again, I think. Not simply as crude summarizes no more nails, but I think we're moving in that direction. So before we open the floor to Q&A, a poll again for you all is quite simply to all of our 250 attendees, do you support a Green New Deal? And be honest, we're tough, we can take it. Tumbleweed. Let's hope for favourable response. Be kind, people. Okay, well, I think that's a good result. So yeah, well, I'm not sure either, really, but we've got to try, haven't we? This looks like a good route map to me, but yes, it's clearly much work to do. Trisha, I'm sure you're dying and bursting to ask some questions that are coming from the
Oh my
audience.
gosh, I'm slightly overwhelmed actually. I said at the beginning of this, I'll manage the chat and the Q&A, and you've asked so many questions. I'm really grateful, and I apologise that I'm not going to be able to get through all of them. But someone has just asked a really good question, and I'm not sure which one of you is the best person to answer. It might be one for you, Aaron, actually, which is, shouldn't we be aiming before 2050? 2050 is 30 years ago, as you rightly pointed out at the very beginning of this session, Aaron. So as a developed country, we should be hitting carbon neutrality way before 50. I won't read the rest of his
completely
message.
I mean, I think that's,
we know we're all on the same
at the
page,
top level, that's enshrined in the Paris Agreement, that, you know, countries, and therefore everyone operating within them, you know, industries and production companies, have to continually up their ambition. So yes, we need to deliver this as quickly as we can, and certainly for the Green New Deal, it's not a plan to deliver it at 2050. It will be as quickly as we can bring everyone together to make it possible.
I think, I mean, just to add another kind of part to that, and thank you, Lawrence, for that great question. You know, at Albert, we see that these industries are so vocational and so inspirational that actually by leading with the most sexiest industries, we can be a great example for all other industries as well to follow suit, and not just rely on some of the more obvious choices to start to make a big impact on this. A couple of questions have come out as well, and not just about government, but also some of the big players in this space. Is it their duty of care to deal with sort of setting the example of this? So studio sites are usually based in very road-centric locations with poor infrastructure for walking, cycling, or linking to public transport. Could the big players of the industry use their collective voice to influence councils to improve the infrastructure and enable more crew to make deep greener journeys? This approach could be trialled at some of the honeypot areas of studios. And someone else asked a question earlier on, which I can't find now, about accommodation. Could the studios offer accommodation on site so that we don't have to travel back and forth? And it's all part of the whole infrastructure end to end, isn't it?
Let's all still live at the studio, shall we? Just start a whole new happy family where we all just live. I mean, I think the role of councils is clear, and especially as we're seeing the clustering of studios, you know, in particularly in the northwest of London and elsewhere as well. We're speaking to councils specifically around the Green New Deal report, because some of this shared infrastructure could you know, live and be facilitated by councils, because, you know, studio space is in short supply at the moment, so it's not reasonable to think potentially we might be able to give over a studio, but with the support of the council we can create the infrastructure outside of the boundaries. Is another question there, Trisha?
Yeah, so it's an alternative question to the question about some of the bigger studios and their duty of care is, we've really talked a lot about tentpole shows, haven't we? And Toby has asked, how scalable are these recommendations and practices for low or micro budget films, or have we focused most of our efforts on obviously the higher impact and therefore the higher emitting productions?
So I guess, you know, we haven't got so much film data in Albert, that's for sure, but we do have some. And we know that largely the challenges faced by small productions are the same as big ones, but just on a much, much larger scale. So I personally believe, you know, that, and I think supported by the data that we collected over the last 10 years, is that by, you know, addressing the big tentpole and making sure the ecosystem is fit for those, that everyone else, you know, the smaller productions will be able to, you know, benefit from that too. But that doesn't mean we can't just not consider that at every point. Absolutely, we have to stop and check and say, hang on, is this working for independent film? Is this working for micro budget film? Because this is about everyone together, not just making sure it works for the big tentpole productions.
So another question that's come up several times, and I wasn't going to bring it because I thought it was a little bit of a tangent, but since so many people have asked it, should we just be adding vegan catering as an absolute requirement for studios to be offering as a matter of course?
Pippa, what do you think?
Thank you.
Well, I think that's an interesting one. I mean, we've been doing meat-free Monday on Call the Midwife for the first time this year, and you know, and everyone's embraced it. I think it's about you know, using local produce, making sure your catering company are using local produce. It doesn't necessarily always have to be vegan, but you know, I think responsible producers want to look at what their crew are eating and make sure they're getting locally sourced sustainable options. So I wouldn't perhaps say you have to make it mandatory that everyone's eating vegan food, but I do think everyone can make better choices perhaps than the choices they're making now.
I think it's important to remember as well that, you know, the UK's Committee on Climate Change say that we need to reduce our meat intake by 20%. So this isn't about a vegan crusade, but just, again, tying it to the science. Trisha, a couple more questions.
Okay, so again, this is a theme that's come up quite a bit about it came up in a previous question, actually, someone sent in advance as well as in the chat today. So wayfinding and communication, and the part that we've talked about in terms of how this digital display and the digital concierge encourages sustainable behaviours. How does that actually translate to the change management, if you like, that we need to see in people's choices? Do you have a sort of view, Definitely, probably, I guess, about how we translate the infrastructure we put into place to the choices and the behaviours that people make on the ground?
So in terms of wayfinding, what we found is that you, like the more kind of, I would say, out there or technologically advanced kind of buildings or sites, as you walk around, it allows you to kind of interact with the site itself and understand what's happening. If there's suddenly been like a change in where something is being filmed, or then you know, or you understand where the kind of waste storage is, or you understand where there is a centralized canteen. Because actually, I know I kind of didn't want to maybe mention this, but I am going to mention this now, is that having vegan meals is one thing, but I think there's much greater impact if actually on studios there was a centralized canteen that's using kind of energy from the grid, which is being decarbonized, rather than having multiple different kind of catering facilities on site that are using diesel generators to produce their food. So there are ways that we can kind of change or encourage and influence habits across the site, as well as how kind of understanding energy consumption, for example, as a production manager. If you are able to get feedback on which parts of studios are using most, and actually other people in there, like for example, if there's a kind of changing area which isn't really being used by anyone, but the lights are being on, you can kind of start to understand that kind of behavior and where there needs to be action. So there is definitely ways in which you can use more wayfinding kind of solutions to influence behavior.
A lot of people are asking if this is going to be available afterwards, and I should just say yes, it is. If you signed up and you're here today, then we will follow up with links to that in due course, hopefully tomorrow with the tech kit on our side. So yes, all of this presentation will be available.
So I think Pippa's going to have to leave us. So thank you to Pippa for joining us. But we're going to take one last question, Trisha. That hopefully me, Devaney, and Tim can answer between us.
Nice question to wrap up and kind of indicate how lots of things work together. The question is, does the Green Rider campaign that Albert did recently help us with the contracts for cast and crew? And I guess then the extension of that help us with some of these solutions. But Aaron, you might be the only person who can answer this one.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, we are coming at this. Every community has a different set of responsibilities, and at Albert we talk a lot about what is our verb. Can productions ask? Can studios innovate? Can industry organisations guide? Everyone has a different tool set, you know. So this is a really meaty report that really is for the intersection between production and studio facilities. But completely, whenever we launch something like the Green Rider for talent, or Green Rider for crew, or update our certification, it is all pushing in this direction of a Green New Deal. That's the way it has to be, but it's not going to be the same intervention and the same communication lines for every community. But we're doing our best to make sure it is all pushing in the right direction, despite being a slightly nuanced conversation. Because as someone pointed out, how many vegan grips do we know in the chat? And I personally don't know any, but perhaps there is a number that I don't know, aren't aware of. It's a nuanced conversation for the same objective. So that's it, folks. Huge thanks to our speakers, Tim, Devaney, Pippa and Trisha, and all of you that have asked questions. Also, thanks again to BFI, BAFTA and Arup, who've done the work to make all of this possible. Thanks to our sponsors, Sergeant Disc, Green Tomato Cars and Good Energy, who support all of our work as well as our industry engagement activities like this. And lastly, thank you to all of you for making it through to 5:30 on the dot. If you have any questions, recommendations, questions, please do, keep coming, keep them coming to us. We are, as we said at the start, this is just the start of the journey. We are so overwhelmed to have so many of you join just the very start of it. And personally, I can't wait to see what happens next. So let's keep talking. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.